What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddie Hudak, and I'll be honest, I've called more than one audible heading into what I wanted to do with today's episode of the show, because for as much as I've centered the last couple of episodes around it being the dead period of the off season, so much has happened this weekend that I've gone in a few different directions and actually going to settle on a different sport here, but I'll navigate us from point A to point B. So I wanted to build off of my conversation with Juice Wyndham, who I had on as my last guest on last Friday's episode, because I think it was such a rich conversation and really got to the heart of how I look at the game of football and the way that I want to bring that analysis onto this show. I went to the Scouting Academy to learn the X's and O's about football. And I think what I took more away from it was more so how to look at things from a different perspective, take more of a bird's eye view. I brought up the book, Take Your Eye Off the Ball, in that same kind of metaphorical sense. I think taking my eye off of a specific team for a while and just looking at it in its purest form, I thought I would get somewhere more with, scheming and strategy. But what I found myself really focusing on is team building and how to build a team of champions, how to win, what that takes, how to battle through adversity, and how to use all of the context that we should really be looking at in order to tell the story. Rather, whether you're looking at it from a scouting perspective and trying to tell the story of a player, trying to tell the story of a team as a reporter, or a more intimate one if you end up being a sideline reporter. But it all goes back to that context. That's the first section that you write in your scouting report. And that can include anything from injuries, which injuries can also tell a story within themselves. Sometimes it's just they have injury after another, and it indicates that they're injury prone, or they have them all on the right side of their body, and it would seem like there's probably something going on there. Or as I was talking about with Deuce on the last episode, depending on the position, let's say, again, a defensive back has bursitis and has, an inflamed hip. Their ability to turn out of their back pedal and run and stride with the receiver is going to be, I think, much more adversely affected than, say, an O-lineman, where, you need lateral agility, but your ability to turn your hips and fluidly get out of that, what matters a lot more to a defensive back. What kind of system were they in on a different team? And that can apply to both college and football at this point. What college system did they come from, and how are you going to fit them into yours? I had brought up Justin Jones as an example in that episode. He was a 3-4 when he was on the Chargers playing nose tackle, which involves a lot more double teams and less sacks, less one-on-one battles. And when he went over to the Chicago Bears, they moved into a 3-tech and a 4-3, which I said that I don't want to alienate people with terminology, and I showed that picture of it last time, but basically the numbering system, that's where he lines up between the guard and the tackle. And it's a lot more one-on-one, trying to actually be more disruptive in the backfield than it is kind of anchoring down that 0-tech position in order to let the edges really get to the quarterback. So all of that to say, I think context is probably the most important thing that I have taken away from, my time in the Scouting Academy. But while I took that really with the intention of covering the Saints with a more holistic perspective and being able to analyze them better, I found myself seeing those lessons play out more in practice as Tulane sideline reporter. And granted, that might be a byproduct of the fact that, it's a different type of access, it's a different type of coverage, but it's really also a different type of vantage point, as I had said on the last episode. And that's something that I really try to take advantage of, and always try to be looking for, what's the deeper story going on here? Because I've been a sideline reporter for 2 seasons now, but those seasons could not have been more night and day, and having to kind of fill in the gaps of how did this Tulane football team, who went to 3 consecutive bowl games, they were building a sense of credibility under Willie Fritz, but it never really seemed like they were able to break through that barrier in any meaningful way. And I show up, and I had talked about this on my episode with Todd, where he had told me to turn on the TV because this kid, Michael Pratt, had just came in for Tulane and he was really something worth watching. And he absolutely is. And he's someone that I think should be very closely watched heading into the draft next season. But I show up at Tulane and then they go 2-10. And it was demoralizing. It was really sad. I felt a lot of emotions this last season, but I felt a different type of emotion in that year. And being able to reflect on it, I've said this a bit in my writing and a little bit in my first episode, but I think I saw a lot of myself in what was going on in that 2-10 year, where all of the pieces were there. It was the same players that proceeded to go 12-2 the next year for the most part. It was a lot of the different coaching staff, but I think they all knew, especially given by the fact that none of them transferred, that the pieces were there, that they had all this potential, but it just wasn't paying off on the field. And that's kind of how I felt in my career path. So I was always someone that, for as chaotic as I really actually am in real life and have leaned into in this point, I was so streamlined on this fake trajectory for the longest time of my life, where I really wanted to decide what my college major was by the time I was applying to college, which I would not recommend. Honestly, I don't know if I have listeners that are under the age of 18, but please don't do that. Like, there's so much value to just getting your feet wet. And all that to be said, I took AP Psych. Absolutely, this is for me. And I spent 4 years working towards that goal. I get out into the field, and yeah, I was good at my job, but it just wasn't paying off in a way that gave me any meaningful value. I didn't feel like I was winning any games, to relate it back whatsoever. And I tried it 3 times, and I'm going to be honest, this was kind of my Hail Mary was going into sports. But when you feel like you have nothing to lose, sometimes that's really the best position to be in. And I think that's really what you saw a lot of the grit in this last Tulane team this last year. But that all being said, I have to always pause. This is really a mouthful to say. The greatest single season turnaround in college football history. It's not a fluke. And I think Tulane should get a lot more credit for that, considering they never really reached that type of mountaintop for 83 years prior to that. It wasn't just, oh, they improved their record, because you looked at a lot of other teams that year and 1 or 2 wins one way or the other. Numbers wise, it's the same situation. But Tulane turned themselves into genuine contenders, legitimate contenders, nationally speaking, in just one season. And that was something that they all believed in January of 2022, 2 months after they lost their 10th game of the season. And the reason that I'm going through this whole long-winded spiel about Tulane, because everyone's probably thinking, like, what's the point of this audible? I keep saying that it's all about relationships in this industry, but I say that also to tell a lot of these stories that I wouldn't otherwise happen upon if I didn't step out of my introverted self. And sports has really pushed me to do that. But I'm at Tracy's this past Sunday, and you can probably hear that my voice is a little hoarse because I am the PA announcer for the New Orleans Jesters, the minor league soccer team here, which they are undefeated at home for the last 2 games. I've been doing that for the last 3 years, but sometimes I get a little too excited and my voice really pays for it. So I kind of stumbled into Tracy's the next day, pretty tired. And I had actually gone there to watch the relegation for the EPL, which honestly, it's kind of surprising to me that I don't follow that more. And I've kind of thought about that. Why not at this point? And I guess I'll follow Everton because that's what I was watching with Todd. But there's 4 games going on at that point, and I grew up playing soccer. I relate everything that I do back to soccer. I bring it up in almost every episode of this show. And my favorite part of the summer a lot of the time is honestly doing the PA announcing for the Jesters because I genuinely love soccer and I miss playing it. But color me surprised when I can't take my eyes off of Tulane baseball playing ECU in the AAC conference tournament. And I'll just say it. I'm someone that I genuinely could not care less about baseball for the most part. I'm sorry to everyone out there. It's something I've tried. Basketball took a long time for me, but it's really soccer and football for me. We're getting there with basketball, but there is just genuinely too much downtime in baseball that my attention span can't handle. But that all being said, I do sometimes think about the nostalgia growing up, going to Candlestick Park, seeing Barry Bonds play. I mean, that's really nothing to sniff at. The days of Tim Lincecum, Buster Posey, who I did not realize was still in the league until like 2 years ago. I watched baseball casually, but it was more of an experience. I was honestly trying to figure out what the strike zone was in the middle of this experience at Tracy's on Sunday. But the reason that it caught my eye was because the record that they had going in there, but I'd seen Corey Glore, the current voice of the Wave, multiple times over the offseason, just kind of randomly in happenstance a lot of the time when I was working with Brooke Kirchhoffer, who went to go kick a field goal with Will Lutz with NewOrleansFootball.network, and she did make one when we were in practice multiple times in the rain at Yeoman. I'd run into him as recently as a few weeks ago. There was really never that much of a hint of optimism there with the baseball team. And there was really never that much of a hint of optimism when we spoke about the football team the season prior, even though I think we all could agree under the surface that it was a better team than the record showed. But I mean, that's as cliche as it gets. You are what your record is. But I thought that I missed something because I was just genuinely didn't understand how Tulane got to that point. And as Corey put it after the game, it's like they went from 2-10 to 12-2 in 6 days, but context. There was a point to all this. I kept thinking back to one of the spring camp practices for football where I was able to see Corey because bless his soul, he does football, basketball, and baseball right after another on top of one another. Much respect to something my voice and my previous vocal nodules just can't handle. But, I kind of asked him because I think the record at that point was just numerically similar to 2-10 in some way. It was that long ago. And, I asked him, like, what's going on here? Because I've said I went to Tulane. Football was really never the topic of conversation when I was there until Yeoman Stadium was built that I only got to experience for 1 year. But all I've known it for, even when I was thinking about going there, was baseball. And it was kind of like the voodoo of New Orleans gave all of that magic to the football team and left none for the baseball team. So we thought. But I had asked him, is it something going on with the lineups? Is it a tough stretch of schedule? Again, I'm lacking all of this context about the baseball team, but I felt this weird emotional kinship with them in a way, even though I really don't follow them and don't know much about them. And I'm sorry for saying that. And I am going to brush up on that immediately, but I knew what it felt like to be at that 2-10 type of feeling, both really living it, on a daily basis with the Tulane football players and really taking those losses to heart as if they were my own. But again, I've had a lot of 2-10 seasons in my life as well. And the same way that I saw myself in the Tulane football team, I could see that in the baseball team. And I just remember him putting it pretty simple, that the coach had pretty much said, I want to make them have a really tough schedule, go on these away game stretches to the West Coast that they're not usually familiar with, these long-standing time out there, because he wanted them to see what it takes to win at the highest level in those types of opponents. Because if they had any business getting to the NCAA tournament for the first time since 2016, you can't get to the dance and not know how to I don't know, go along to the song. But I remembered him saying that, and I thought, okay, well, on its face, that makes sense. But like I said, I know the Tulane football guys and I know their mental toughness, but I just don't know it enough. And so I was just thinking, is there a point where that becomes demoralizing and you lose too many of the games and you just can't see the light at the end of the tunnel? Because that was always something I pondered with the Tulane football team. And yeah, I didn't have the same thing in terms of purposely scheduling that type of schedule, though, the opening of the season with Oklahoma and Ole Miss was nothing to sneeze at. But I just always kind of think about, was there one game that just kind of made all the wind go out of their sails that they might not even be aware of? And it probably didn't happen because I did watch them fight all the way until the end of regulation. And again, one of the best Tajay Spears games that I'll ever be able to see from the sideline in Memphis, the end of the 2021 season. But I thought about, the Tulsa loss where missed a pretty short field goal, went to double overtime. And it was just, it wasn't double overtime. It was double overtime. Michael Pratt's first season, but they went to overtime. It was homecoming. That one hit me like a train as my first season as a sideline reporter. All of that to be said, I always wondered, would there be a point where this just gets too demoralizing for them to be able to get back out there and fight? And so I was wondering that about the baseball team. And just being on Twitter for the last few months, it didn't really seem like that lesson was going to be learned. But I hope that everyone really thinks about those comments and sees what they were just able to do, really in spite of everything saying that they had no business being in this conversation, coming in as the 7th seed with a record of, I'm not sure what it was. I believe it was 15-39. They ended with 19-40. There's so many games in baseball, but they're the lowest seed to ever win this tournament, and they beat the top seed in doing so. And all they had to do was go on a running conference play. And it just makes it all really seem so simple at the end of the day, where if you just say one game at a time, I think people probably laugh at you and start to tune you out. It's kind of like the 1-0 mentality, to be entirely honest with you, where it's hard for, I think, outsiders to get along with that if they can't really understand everything that's going on behind the scenes. They don't know all of the slight injuries that aren't being mentioned, but I know are affecting guys, or something going on in their life, something about the other team that I've been told in confidence and, I'm not going to share, but it almost felt like I was bursting like a top at times. And two teams in one season, for the first time in school history, became AAC conference champions. I just don't know what to do with that, honestly. And we're talking about not that well known of a school, nationally speaking, I think, up until recently. It's a small private school. It's about 6,000 undergrad when I went there. I think it's something up to like 10,000 now. It's primarily Chicago, California, mostly the East Coast. And it really wasn't, when I applied, known as a football school or really any sport when I was there, except, baseball. But it's a G5 program. And if you erase this last year, why would anyone care? But I don't think that you can have these type of underdog stories always in sometimes situations like the Power Five. These really like diamond in the rough situations, I think, are very unique to G5 programs, because at the end of the day, as much as we differentiate between these two, you still have to beat the best of the best in order to become the champion, no matter if you're that lowly G5 team that gets into the New Year's Six. But you just think about Tulane being quite literally 1 inch away from converting a 4th down against Oklahoma the season before that, beating the Big 12 champions in Kansas State last season, beating Cincinnati, who went to the college football playoffs the year prior, Houston and UCF, 1-1, I guess, there, who all are going to the Big 12. Then they beat Pac-12 USC team with the active Heisman Trophy winner. And I go back to 2 episodes ago. This is a song that never runs out before the whistle. Where I was talking about the NCAA and the transfer portal and how it really, disproportionately affects G5 programs. But I don't know what it was about this win for Tulane baseball, but that kind of changed everything for me on my perspective of what the G5 can really offer that I just don't think that other teams can. And maybe it's not the G5, maybe it's just Tulane, and maybe that's the point all along. It does genuinely feel like one of those Cinderella stories that if you wrote a movie about it, they would throw it in the trash or give it to Happy Madison Productions and have Adam Sandler make some joke out of it, because it truly is so ridiculous to wrap your head around. But trying not to get off track here, I go back to that episode and thinking about player expectations and motivation and reasons for choosing a school and what they want out of a program, keeping in mind that in that same study that I had mentioned in that episode, I think 70% of the players said it was somewhat likely that they would become a professional athlete in the sport that they play. 70% of the college football players answered that was somewhat likely or higher. Yet 0.02% of college football players get drafted into the NFL. So that expectation doesn't really line up with the motivation, but that doesn't mean that players shouldn't have those dreams, obviously, because you just think about, again, someone like Nick Anderson, who, if you ask me, this is really all a ripple effect of his manifestation of believing in yourself when everyone else thinks you're crazy. And that not only led to the biggest turnaround in college football history, but landed him on the Saints when a lot of people counted him out for an uncontrollable measure. But what does it really take to get what you need out of a G5 program? You look at the responses that a lot of those players said in their motivations for choosing a program. The overwhelming top response was coaching staffs and a pathway to development to the NFL. My long-winded point of all of this is, in the Scouting Academy, we learn 5 universal traits that apply to every position and 5 specific traits that are for defensive back: range, man coverage, blocking ability. I'm trying to think, because that was my position group before that, versus defensive line, motor, use of hands, ability to understand run and blocking schemes. Those are all position-specific traits. The 5 universal traits are athletic ability, mental processing, competitive toughness, play strength, and play speed. Athletic ability, fairly obvious. Now, granted, initial quickness in your back pedal is more helpful for a defensive back than it is for a quarterback, but we don't know what that is. Mental processing, I talked about it with Deuce. It's called a bunch of different things: football IQ, instincts. You can pretty much call it any of them, but I think there's arguments for why, at least I know the Scouting Academy sticks away from instincts, because it kind of implies that it can't be taught. Getting on a tangent there. Play speed is the marrying of mental processing and athletic ability. So you can be the fastest guy in the world, but if you can't make the correct read, then it doesn't matter, because you're going to end up 10 feet out of position. In the same way, you could be able to diagnose every play on the field, but if you are way too slow in your footwork or don't have any lateral agility, you're never going to be able to be a coverage linebacker. And then play strength, one-on-one functional strength, blocking against press coverage, that kind of stuff. Then there's something called competitive toughness. And that's the heart of what I'm really trying to get at here today. It's an umbrella term that describes 3 different characteristics: competitiveness. And I know that seems like an obvious word, but it's really, do they really give effort regardless of the circumstances? How do they perform at home versus away? Do they perform the same when they have that crowd noise, or when it's completely silent, when they're down 30 points, their quarterback just went out and there's like the 49ers last year, perfect example where they fought their butts off to the end when they literally did not have a quarterback to field in that game. Excuse me. Like I said, this voice is really living on a prayer here. Anyways, competitiveness. That's, do you still keep pounding the drum no matter what kind of thing? Or do you just kind of give up and phone it in? And see that happen a lot of the time. Then physical toughness, nuanced, but the toughness aspect of it being, even if they're not able to win, it's not asking about strength. It's, are they willing and giving full effort to really try to physically outmatch their opponent? And then you get mental toughness, which I think characterizes a lot of different things. Performance under pressure, which you often see as choking, and that happens a lot of the time in every single sport. Do they show the ability to learn in the moment and improve from their mistakes on the field? I keep going back to defensive back, but it's also the best position group. That is the best example of this. They have to have a short memory. They are going to get burned sometimes. It is just simply the nature of their position. What's more valuable than their ability to not get burned is their ability to shake that off immediately the next play, because there is no time to pout in between snaps. But really, how do you perform in critical moments? Third down, fourth down, end of a half, in the red zone, fourth quarter. Get specific. When you're down 15 points with 4 minutes remaining against the active Heisman Trophy winner, how do you respond? When you've won 15 games all season going into a conference, what is it that these coaches have been able to instill in these teams to see something for themselves when, quite honestly, it just doesn't make sense on paper? At least as an outside observer. It's really what I'm getting at here. The last 2 seasons of Tulane football make perfect sense to me on paper. Baseball less so because I'm unfamiliar with it. But what they both showed is that a trait that seems to be consistent in Tulane coaches is their ability to cultivate true competitive toughness in their athletes. And there are a lot of things that you can teach your athletes. Teach them scheme. Teach them how to use your hands at the line of scrimmage. How to be a true cover man corner. I think what a lot of programs neglect, and maybe that's because they've always been successful, but how do you cultivate and coach up competitive toughness in your players without creating chaos? One of my episode ideas for this show that I won't totally give away, but I've been doing my research for it, and it's just reminded me, bringing up this Sean Payton quote from his mentor, Bill Parcells, who Willie Fritz has also brought up quite a few times this last season. That's what I was trying to get out of my mouth. My tongue just was not getting with the program there. And I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was the art of creating a crisis and doing that on purpose. If you read Home Team by Sean Payton, he talks about, a lot of the ways that he motivated players, and a lot of it was fear-based, but validly so. And creating a crisis essentially and seeing how they performed. I don't know how much you could say that was deliberate on the Tulane football team this last year, but I also think you could say that they could clearly see that they were living in a state of chaotic dysfunction the last year. And rather than all jump ship, they thought, okay, maybe this could have been the best thing that ever happened to all of us. And you just, again, think about the mental toughness of someone like Nick Anderson and his fortitude of working through no college showcase invites and jumping 6 inches over his previous best on his vertical jump at pro day, or his broad jump at pro day, and 4 inches over his vertical jump. But you have to wonder whether or not that was exactly what Coach Ullman was doing with the baseball team, was the art of creating a crisis seeing how your players respond. Because otherwise, I don't know how you cultivate that skill. When I had written about Nick Anderson the last 2 times that I have, but the first time I did, and I said this about all the Tulane players after watching them at Pro Day, was they bring something sincerely valuable to an NFL locker room. The ability to see the light at the end of the tunnel when it's completely dark in there. And everyone has turned off their night lights to help you out in the process. Think back to when the Saints went on something like a 4-game losing streak last year. And you heard players like Alvin Kamara, guys that were at SEC, Big 12, ACC programs used to winning on a regular basis, really not knowing what that felt like. And it really kind of shaking them. And so I think that when you talk about what can a G5 program offer, it's not going to be the biggest spotlight. It's not going to be the biggest O-line in the world or, the biggest NIL deals. But what I would be looking for in a program is the ability for them to coach up mental toughness. Because if you take everything else out of the equation and you just look at the context of the last 2 seasons, where from a football perspective, yeah, there were some coaching staff changes, but they were pretty much the exact same starters from the last year. What happened there? It wasn't just they brought in some magical scheme consultant, because I can tell you that's not the case. It was all built from within, and it was all just built on toughness. And the fact that 10 of those players went on to be signed by NFL teams, that they're the 2 highest players taken in the NFL draft this year in Tajay Spears and Dorian Williams since Matt Forte in 2008. And we are talking about the same team that won 2 games the previous season. And not everyone was saying, well, what are they all doing coming back from another year? That's competitive toughness. And to me, that is the most unique trait that Tulane players have. And it could not have paid off more in spades. So when I try to look at learning through the Scouting Academy, it's hard to kind of think about those intangible things. Like, how do you really judge competitive toughness on film? And I don't really have the answer for you, to be honest, yet. But now I know what story to kind of go look for. And I joked on the last episode about a simple Google search, but really, guys, I don't think a lot of people watched every single game of Tulane's season the season before last year. I don't really blame them, but then you can't really make comments on anything to do with their turnaround without knowing all the story, unless you've really done some fastidious research on it. Which, when I'm scouting players for the Scouting Academy, admittedly, I'm not going to become a PhD in 6 different teams for each position group. But now I know what stories that I need to be looking for, and that really matter when it comes to player development, because that's ultimately what gets you to the NFL or the MLB. But what I think is just bigger than football and baseball here is really just being in the midst of a legacy that I don't think anyone ever saw coming be built at Tulane University. And when you talk about all this conference realignment and everything in flux right now, everything is a butterfly effect. And this will genuinely be the year that I think everyone will look back on as the year that everything changed. I had said in the past for Tulane football, but it's Tulane University at this point. And that was my complete ramble of this episode brought to you by Memorial Day. I hope, again, some people might get annoyed by these rants that last this long. And I've never promised to be concise. If you have followed me as a writer, then you also know that I can't really do that there either. But what I really can do is, again, I genuinely will bring 15 angles into the conversation and truly try to bring every part of insight and knowledge and crossover that I can in order to help everyone see the points that I'm trying to make and learn in the process. Because I think that the more that you can take something out of just a specific football sense. And again, where I've done these soccer to football comparisons. But now that I can really see these parallels in baseball, at the end of the day, I think if you stripped away all the rules, the players are more similar than you might expect. And that might sound obvious, but when it comes to an athlete, it really all has to do with their competitive drive. And at Tulane, that's happening in spades now. So I'm off to OTAs, and I will be breaking that down on this upcoming episode this week. Finally, unfortunately, those are on Tuesdays. The show comes out on Tuesdays. I typically tend to have guests on Fridays, so timing wise has not really been that easy for me to cover OTAs, but Tulane just again keeps stealing the show, and I'm not going to fight them about it. So I'm off to OTAs, and I think you guys will enjoy my guest on Friday and one I have in the pipeline coming up as well. As always, if you enjoy what I have to say, or if you're just feeling generous, please remember to like and subscribe on all platforms if possible, on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. All of it helps me, guys. And I just, again, appreciate all of the positive reception to all that I've said so far, because to be honest with you, I've pretty much been entirely random with every episode, and it has felt like I've been taking, a risk with what people think they can get out of the show, but it seems like you guys appreciate the chaos, and I appreciate you more for it. See you Friday.